Greetings, members, one and all of the Salivation Nation. Another Federal Reserve scandal? I think it's time to stack gold and silver. Let's explore! Most of you who frequent this channel and others like it regularly, we already know that it's wise to stack gold and silver because every time we do, we declare our independence from any financial institution of any sort, of any kind, under any government or any private entity. And that is declaring our independence. And I think there's good reason now more than ever. I'm going to be referencing two different articles. One, as was shared with me by a member of the community here, about a potential scandal that is kind of coming to light based off of what happened in 2019. And this is from the New York Sun. Did Chairman Powell seek to sabotage Trump's nomination of Judy Shelton to the Federal Reserve Board? In this interview on CNBC, some of you may have seen this, is from 2019. He was very cautious about it, about answering the question, should we go on a gold standard? And of course, we all know what his thoughts are on that. If President Biden nominates Jerome Powell for his second term as chairman of the Federal Reserve, the question for which we'll be waiting is whether Mr. Powell tried to derail the nomination to the Fed's board of Judy Shelton. President Trump had signaled his plan to nominate Ms. Shelton in July 2019. In a razor-thin vote in late 2020, though, Ms. Shelton was defeated when two Republicans voted no and one failed to show up at all. And I didn't realize it was that close. It turns out that just before that vote, one of the most dramatic in the history of the Federal Reserve, Chairman Powell got on an extraordinary string of telephone calls with senators who could be key. We don't yet know what was said on those calls, which is the precipice for this editorial. The calls, though, were logged on the Fed's website. All the more reason that if Mr. Powell is renominated, at least one senator should ask what he was doing. Mr. Powell himself has suggested that it would be out of place for him to take sides on a nomination. Right after President Trump tweeted his plan to nominate Ms. Shelton, Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton, a Democrat, at a hearing asked Mr. Powell about the gold standard. The chairman immediately noted that this could be considered commenting on a particular nominee. And of course I would not do that. We do not play a role in the nomination process, Mr. Powell explained. It's totally up to the president and the Senate, and we are completely on the sidelines. All right. Yet Mr. Powell did voice his opposition to the gold standard, some elements of which Ms. Shelton has supported. Mr. Powell didn't say so, but elevating Ms. Shelton to the board of the Fed might have led to a breach of the unanimity that has obtained among the governors under Chairman Powell. No dissenting votes on monetary policy have been recorded on the Board of Governors in Mr. Powell's and Janet Yellen's entire tenures as chairman. The nomination drama intensified on November the 12th when the Senate agreed to proceed to the confirmation vote on the 17th. Bloomberg News reported that Ms. Shelton's nomination had gained new life on the 14th, though Senator Rick Scott, a Republican, announced that he was self-quarantining after exposure to COVID. Senators Blumenthal and Murphy, both Democrats, said they'd do the same. Then on the 16th, Lamar Alexander, Republican from Tennessee, announced that he opposed Ms. Shelton's nomination but would not be in Washington for the vote. That, the Washington Post estimated, put the Shelton confirmation on knife edge. That afternoon, Chairman Powell got on the phone. At 1 p.m., he spoke with Senator Mike Rounds, a member of the Banking Committee. I'm reading this verbatim because I think it's important to note exactly what happened here through this process. The conversation is listed in Chairman Powell's online calendar, as are others. At 5 p.m., Mr. Powell spoke with Senator Jack Reed, a Democrat. 5:45, he spoke yet with another committee member, Tom Cotton, a Republican. At 6:15, Mr. Powell spoke with Mitt Romney. who, along with Senator Susan Collins of Maine, had come out earlier against Ms. Shelton's confirmation. On the 17th, the day of the vote, Senator Grassley announced he too would be self-quarantining. From Senator Romney, a courtesy known as pairing was sought and would have canceled the effect of either one being absent. Mr. Romney refused. His hostility has long struck us as newsworthy, given that he had stood for president in 2012 on a platform calling for establishing a commission to look at monetary reform. Yeah, I kind of remember that. Monetary Commission is one of Ms. Shelton's goals. Its aim would be to look at, among other things, the restoration of a metallic standard for the dollar. It seems, though, that Mr. Romney's support was shallow, which the voters may have figured out in 2012. For sure, Mr. Romney turned out to be pretty much a wolf in wolf's clothing after what happened in recent years. In any event, the Senate was readying its vote on Ms. Shelton's nomination. Mr. Powell spoke by phone with two other GOP salons, Tom Tillis and Ben Sasse. Spokesman for Tom Tillis emails us that the senator spoke with Mr. Powell about the regulatory issues and that Mr. Shelton didn't come up. He notes that Mr. Tillis was a strong supporter of Ms. Shelton, and both in the banking committee and on the Senate floor. Mr. Tillis is the only senator who replied to our inquiries about the phone calls of Mr. Powell, nor did the Fed itself reply to a request from the Sun for comment. So she lost the vote 49-48 because all 47 Democrats, including Blumenthal and Murphy, voting against her were joined by Mr. Romney and Ms. Collins, while Senator Alexander lurked in Tennessee and Mr. Grassley was out, so there was no tie for Vice President Pence to break. Senator McConnell then switched his vote to nay so he could bring the matter up again, though success was fast receding. There were some hopes for second vote before Democrat Mark Kelly of Arizona was sworn in to replace Republican Martha McSally. It seems, though, that on December 2nd, Mr. Powell spoke with Ms. McSally on the phone. We don't know what Mr. Powell said then either, but the Senate, if he is renominated, should ask him about all his conversations with the senators. I don't think it's his place to be calling senators for a vote like this, especially when he was adamant in that testimony. So this could be another big scandal brewing. And wait till you hear what's coming up next after this, which I'm going to read as well. But I think it's very important to read every word of these two pieces here. There could well be an innocent explanation for all of these calls on the eve of the vote. So at least the Sun is giving that precipice, because we don't know what was said for sure, but it would be a serious matter if the Fed chairman tried to put his thumb on the senatorial scale. With Ms. Shelton's fate in limbo, the Wall Street Journal issued an important editorial in her support, suggested that Senator Alexander's professed fear for the Fed's independence had it exactly backwards and called on Mr. Alexander to reconsider. The Fed needs Mrs. Shelton's voice, the journal reckoned, because the Fed is already sacrificing its independence. Boy, that's the understatement of the century. Once Mr. Kelly was sworn in, hopes for diversity of thought on the two Fed board then hung by a thread. If that, on the outcome of the two Senate runoff races in Georgia, or one of the two recalcitrant Republicans, in any event on December the 8th, in a rare lunch at the Fed headquarters, Mr. Powell's schedule notes the chairman did sit down with a guest, the soon-to-be former senator from Tennessee. Very interesting indeed. And no, this article I think is quite fair, the New York Sun, because it's not actually accusing, but it's the appearance of impropriety that it is certainly something that has caused one of the biggest critics of the Fed to write this column late last month in September by Ron Paul. The biggest Federal Reserve scandal, and this is quite damning. Following revelations that Federal Reserve officials made trades in financial assets while the Fed was taking extraordinary efforts to stimulate the economy. And by the way, I posted a video about that very thing, a scandal for sure that is going to be very interesting to see where that plays out. Federal Reserve Jerome Powell ordered a review of the Fed's ethic rules. While these trades appear problematic, they pale in comparison to the biggest Fed scandal, The Fed's impoverishment of ordinary Americans, enrichment of the elites, and facilitation of government debt and deficits. And boy, that first paragraph alone says it all for sure. The depression induced by coronavirus, though really caused by so-called public health action governments took in response, was the official reason for the Fed's increased asset purchases last year. However, the Fed actually started ramping up its money-creating activities in September of 2019. I also chronicled that on this channel. Those were the repurchase agreements. It began pouring billions a day into the repo markets, which banks use to make short-term loans to each other in order to keep repo market interest rates low. And well stated, Ron Paul. That's exactly right. That's what they did. We chronicled it here. Many of us were very concerned at that time, long before COVID-19 was a thing. Coronavirus was just a convenient excuse for the Fed to do more of what it was already doing. Now the Fed is using the limited reopening as a scapegoat for rising prices. Of course, anyone who understands Austrian economics understands that rising prices are a symptom, not a cause of inflation. Inflation is a very act of money creation by the Fed. Exactly right. Amen, brother. That's going to be a recurring theme in my commentary on this. And that's just it. The power of the purse should rest with Congress. But the Fed is just doing more quantitative easing. And by the way, I was initially for some of the what I call the relief package, the initial relief package, for a temporary measure because the government had mandated these closures for a time, which was no fault of any business. So therefore, I was for it because of this extraordinary circumstance. But it has gone crazy since then. And really, in retrospect, we probably should have never have closed down in the first place. And when we look in retrospect, there's other things that could have been done better, but nonetheless, we really didn't know at the time exactly how serious this was, but that's a whole nother matter. Rising prices that diminish the average American standard of living are not the only result of the Fed's manipulation of the money supply. The manipulation distorts economic signals, producing results including booms, bubbles, and busts. And by the way, even the way they report inflation now has been distorted with how they reported it before. Inflation has always benefited the well-connected elites who receive the Fed's newly created money before the new money causes widespread price increases. The true motivation behind Fed policies was revealed by former Fed official Andrew Hustler in 2013. Huzar, writing for the Wall Street Journal, confirmed the quantitative easing kept stock prices high instead of helping Americans struggling with the after effects of the 2008 meltdown. And I'm going to stop right there because he's exactly right. In fact, I cringed every time Donald Trump, when he was president, lauded this all-time stock market high, because that was all just pumped up by the Fed. That's all that liquidity in there. And it's really the kind of thing that he should be against. But he was also all for, all this money being printed and created anyway. So the blame goes to both parties and both presidents indeed. But nonetheless, that's, again, another story there. Other beneficiaries of the Fed are big spending politicians. Amen. Exactly right. The Federal Reserve's purchase of federal debt instruments keeps the federal government's debt servicing costs manageable. This is why, despite Chairman Powell's recent suggestion that the Fed will soon begin tapering its purchases of the treasuries, the Fed is unlikely to significantly reduce its purchases of treasuries or allow interest rates to significantly increase. And by the way, keep in mind that tapering can be likened to a faucet. And right now that faucet is pretty much wide open. And I'm trying to be fair about this. I'm not saying it's completely, just completely maxed out and there's just water gushing everywhere. I'm trying to be as fair as I can about this. But all it means is that there is water coming out of that faucet at a pretty incredible rate. And tapering means you just turn that faucet just a little bit back. So there's still a lot of water coming out, when in reality that faucet should be turned off. But nonetheless, Some of them say, well, you're bringing some of the water back in and recycling some of the water when you take in and some of the old currency and destroy it. But nonetheless, it's a drop in the bucket for sure. Nonetheless, Powell is also unlikely to upset President Biden and Biden's congressional allies as long as progressives are urging Biden not to reappoint Powell. Progressives want to replace Powell with someone more committed to fighting climate change and systemic racism, two boogeymen routinely brought out as excuses for vast expansions to government spending and power. I will also add to that as far as climate change and systemic racism, but also other areas of social justice that are related, that maybe can cross both paths. But you're right. He's exactly right. Climate change and systemic racism are definitely used all the time, and it's a shame that they exploit those subject matters for political purposes. Another major scandal involving the Fed is Congress's refusal to pass the Audit the Fed bill and let American people know the truth about the Fed's operations. Audit the Fed authorizes a government accountability office audit of the Fed's dealing with foreign governments and central banks. The Fed's discount window operations, reserves of member banks' securities, credits, interest on deposits, and open market transactions. Audit the Fed would finally reveal the truth about the Fed's operation. And I like this about Ron Paul because he's being very fair in this last sentence, because I've talked to a leftist friend of mine years ago. He says there already are audited the Fed. And that's right. A limited audit authorized by the Dodd-Frank Act found that between 2007 and 2010, the Federal Reserve committed over $16 trillion to foreign central banks and politically influenced private companies. Imagine what a full audit would find. It's time to end the scandal of allowing a secretive central bank to have so much power over the economy and our liberty. And you just wait until they get a progressive in there and by the way, and it should also be noted that Janet Yellen, as Treasury Secretary, purpose and her mission statement is to involve some of these social justice aspects, climate change, equity, and all that stuff into our monetary policy. It has no right, no place in there at all. So this closes with something that I agree with now. I don't preach it like crazy from my channel, but I do believe with Ron Paul when he says in the very last sentence of this, it is time to audit and end the Fed. Let that sink in, folks. You tell me one thing that the Federal Reserve is doing to make the dollar stable and to maximize employment, which are the two things that Jerome Powell said in this interview, this questioning before Congress in 2019. I would argue very little to none in stabilizing monetary policy, especially since they have gone wildfire with quantitative easing. They're doing more harm than good at this point, and they don't want to have any constraints, and a metallic standard would give them those constraints, and they don't want any part of that. Very interesting indeed. Thanks again to the anonymous member of the community who shared this with me. Folks, this is why we stack gold and silver. We hold these metals to be self-evident because what they do is they preserve financial independence and they recognize God's money created for a sound monetary policy. And you and I can have a sound monetary policy within our own homes or storage facilities by holding physical gold and silver. And by the way, I'm not against holding gold or silver in any other form that you so desire in the electronic markets, but I believe in holding physical gold and silver as well to really protect ourselves against what I feel is a corrupt system these days, And I believe Ron Paul really stated it quite apropos in this piece. And by the way, this comes from the Ron Paul Institute. And by the way, I've had disagreements with Ron Paul in the past politically, and probably still do. But nonetheless, on this issue, I have come to agree with him even much more so than ever on this issue with regards to the Fed. They are out of control. And with what we've been hearing about now, a possible another scandal that really needs to be investigated. And if Powell is renominated, and in 2022 or sometime Republicans take control, if that were to happen, we'll see if he's brought to answer for these phone calls that have taken place to potentially shut out Judy Shelton, who definitely, I've heard her speak, and she is a sharp and there definitely has a lot of great ideas. And I think views like that are being alienated, and it's just a shame. Let me know your thoughts below. I'd like to extend a multitude of gratitude to you all for taking the time to watch, and encourage you to please rate, share, comment, and subscribe.